Welcome to the deep dive. We take that stack of sources you're curious about, we process it, and basically give you the key takeaways fast.
Yep, tailored for you so you get informed without getting buried in information.
Exactly. So today we're diving into the Policy Agenda 2025 V1 final from the Erotic Service Providers Legal Education and Research Project, ESPLER for short.
Right, ESPLER Project, Inc. And this document, it's really more than just like a policy paper. It's a pretty detailed roadmap they've laid out.
A roadmap for changing laws around sex work, yeah. But it touches on bigger things too, right? Like human rights, public
Right,
health.
technology, definitely. It's got a wide scope.
Okay, so our mission today is to really get under the skin of ESLR's arguments, understand their thinking, the context, and maybe unpack some surprising perspectives along the way.
Sounds good. Where should we start? The framing seems key.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that really jumps out is how they frame the whole issue. It's this rights-based approach, they call it.
Mm-hmm. And that's crucial. Instead of starting with, sex workers are criminals or sex workers are victims needing rescue, they start from the idea that consenting adults involved in sex work are individuals with rights. Full stop.
That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
Completely. Because if you start with rights and autonomy, the solutions you look for are totally different than if you start from, morality or needing to save people.
Right. And they connect sex work directly to some really fundamental human rights. Things like
Privacy, bodily autonomy, equal protection under the law, personal safety.
even the right to choose your work, how you earn a living. It's a much broader frame than you usually hear.
Exactly. They're essentially arguing that laws against sex work, they violate these basic rights. And their big point is these laws don't actually stop sex work.
No, they just push it underground.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which makes it way more dangerous for everybody involved. Sex workers can't easily get help. If they're harmed, they're less likely to report crimes. It just increases vulnerability.
It seems like a strong argument against the current system. Now, they use this term erotic service provider. That sounds intentionally broad.
It is, and that's important. They want to include a whole spectrum of people earning money from erotic labor. So not just street-based workers.
But dancers, adult film performers, people making content online.
Right. Anyone in that commercial sex industry. And interestingly, they explicitly include survivors of sex trafficking in that definition, too.
Okay, that's a nuanced point. Not equating the two, but acknowledging that someone's past experience doesn't preclude them from identifying as a provider later.
Exactly. It recognizes complexity. And they're also very specific about language for others involved, like client and support staff. Seems deliberate.
Yeah, avoiding terms like John, for instance.
Definitely. They're pushing back against that dehumanizing language. Client frames it as a more neutral transaction. Support staff acknowledges the whole ecosystem. Receptionists, security, web admins, recognizes the different roles.
Okay, and then there's the distinction between criminalization and decriminalization. Their definitions are specific here too. Why is that important?
Super important because these words get thrown around. For ESLER, criminalization isn't just outright bans. It's any law that targets sex workers or clients unfairly, even indirectly, like loitering laws used selectively.
Or immigration laws linking deportation to sex work charges.
Exactly. And decriminalization for them means getting rid of all criminal laws specifically targeting consensual adult sex work, just removing them from the criminal code.
And that's different from legalization or regulation.
Very different. Legalization usually means the state sets up rules, licenses, zones, specific regulations. ESPLR generally prefers full decriminalization. They're also critical of the Nordic model.
Right, the end demand approach, where buying sex is illegal but selling isn't. What's their problem with that?
They call it asymmetric criminalization. Their worry is, while it looks like it helps sellers, it still creates stigma and pushes things underground. If clients fear arrest, it's harder for workers to screen them or negotiate safe terms.
So it doesn't really eliminate the risk, it just shifts it, maybe even increases it in some ways.
That's their argument, yeah. It still makes the whole interaction riskier.
They also bring up history, pointing out that, widespread criminalization in the U.S. is actually relatively recent, early 20th century Mann Act era. Why mention that?
To show that the current system isn't some ancient moral truth. It was a policy choice made not that long ago, which means, different policy choices are possible now. It reframes the debate away from tradition.
Okay, so that's the groundwork. Rights-based approach, careful definitions, historical context. Now let's dig into their specific criticisms of criminalization. What are the main harms they point to?
Well, the biggest one is increased danger and vulnerability. When it's illegal, it happens in the shadows, right? So workers are much less likely to call the police if they're robbed or assaulted.
Because they fear being arrested themselves.
Exactly. They mention examples of police misconduct during stings, too, like that incident in Texas back in November 2024. It creates mistrust.
And they bring up that really disturbing quote from the Green River Killer.
Yeah, about targeting sex workers because he thought no one would miss them. Easy targets.
Yeah.
It's chilling, but it highlights how marginalization can have fatal consequences.
So it undermines their ability to seek justice.
Definitely. If your job itself is illegal, reporting a crime against you becomes incredibly risky. It basically gives perpetrators a kind of impunity.
And there are health impacts too.
Yeah, like even carrying condoms could be used as evidence against you in some places, which discourages safer sex. Plus, criminalization makes it harder for workers to organize, to advocate collectively for better conditions or safety measures.
It creates a cycle of vulnerability.
Mm,
And they argue it empowers law enforcement in potentially harmful ways.
right. Beyond just arrests, they talk about harassment, invasions of privacy through things like data scraping or surveillance.
And arrests that might mislabel someone as a trafficking victim without solid proof. It sounds like the system itself can cause harm.
That's the core of their critique. Arrests can lead to further victimization in jail, denial of services, and criminal records that mess up your life long term. Forced registration sometimes.
And it's not just ESPLR saying this stuff, is it?
No, not at all. They point to a growing list of major international groups, Amnesty International, the WHO, UAINS,
All supporting decriminalization for human rights and public health reasons.
and big U.S. groups, too, like the ACLU, Lambda Legal. It shows this isn't some fringe idea anymore. There's broad recognition across different sectors that the current approach is problematic.
Okay, that widespread support is significant. Now,
Mm.
they also really deconstruct the war on sex trafficking. This part feels particularly pointed.
It is. They don't really mince words here. They basically frame a lot of the anti-trafficking rhetoric as a kind of modern moral panic.
Calling it an anti-sex and anti-prostitution crusade. It's strong language.
Yeah, and they argue it functions a bit like the war on drugs. Lots of resources going into essentially misdemeanor prostitution stings, but framed as rescuing trafficking victims.
A disconnect between the public messaging and where the enforcement money actually goes.
That's what they suggest. And they question the trafficking statistics often used, arguing that some groups and agencies might inflate numbers or promote, sensational stories to get funding and public support.
They cite that DOJ Bureau of Justice statistics numbered 203 total cases for all trafficking types in 2024, which seems way lower than the rhetoric often implies.
Right. And they contrast that with the funding, like around $105 million in 2024 for anti-trafficking efforts. Their question is that money really helping actual survivors, or is it funding this broader anti-sex work push? They also bring up civil forfeiture.
Yes, the rentboy.com case, where the site was seized, money taken, but no trafficking charges actually filed against the operators.
Exactly. It illustrates how these tools can be used in ways that seem maybe unrelated to the stated goal of fighting trafficking.
And the Super Bowl example, Operation Reclaim and Rebuild.
Yeah, presented as a big anti-trafficking win, but most arrests were just for prostitution, often nowhere near the actual event. ESPLR sees this as a pattern. Relabeling routine vice stings as human trafficking operations, because it sounds better.
So their argument is that blurring consensual sex work and trafficking is inaccurate and harmful. It misdirects resources.
That's the core of it. It distracts from the real needs of actual trafficking survivors and fuels the campaign against consensual sex work.
Okay, let's talk specific laws they criticize under this anti-trafficking umbrella. FOSTA comes up first.
Right, FOSTA. Intended to fight online trafficking, but it made internet platforms liable for user content that could be related to trafficking. But crucially, it didn't really distinguish that from consensual adult stuff.
And the result was?
Widespread deplatforming. Sex workers got kicked off safer online sites, pushing them towards riskier street work or less transparent platforms. They lost control over screening clients, setting terms.
And didn't a government report find FOSTA wasn't even that useful for prosecutions?
Yeah, the GAO report they mentioned said prosecutors didn't use it much, and older laws were often better. Plus, that 4 years of FOSTA study found it actually increased violence and reduced safety for workers, the opposite of what was intended.
Wow. Okay, what about the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act?
Their concern there, and with similar state laws, is that the definition of sex trafficking can be incredibly broad. So broad, they argue, it could potentially criminalize normal relationships.
Like a roommate paying shared rent, or a partner offering support could somehow fall under these laws.
That's the fear, that these expansive definitions lead to over-policing, maybe targeting marginalized groups, as that USC Gould report suggested, and the global database of convictions under TVPA raises privacy and due process flags for them too.
Then there are safe harbor laws, meant to help minors, but ESPLER sees potential downsides.
Yeah, they worry that automatically placing youth into protective custody isn't always the best or most supportive approach for their long-term well-being. It can be another form of institutionalization.
They also quickly mention the Earn IT Act and age verification laws. Similar concerns.
Pretty much. Worries about eroding online privacy, increasing surveillance, without clear proof that they actually make kids safer. It feels like a pattern to them. Laws with good intentions but harmful side effects.
So, given all these critiques, what's the alternative ESPLER pushes for? Decriminalization and harm reduction seem to be the focus.
Exactly. They point to places where decriminalization has actually happened, and they argue worked well. New Zealand is the big example.
The Prostitution Reform Act 2003, what happened there?
According to the reviews ESPLR cites, there wasn't a big boom in the sex industry, but crucially, sex workers reported better safety, better relationships with police, more power to refuse unsafe clients. Their rights improved.
And they mentioned other places too. Australia, Belgium.
Yeah, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, and Australia have variations. Belgium, parts of Mexico City, Spain. Each is a bit different. Some have limitations, like excluding immigrants in parts of Australia shows there's no one single model.
But despite these international examples, the U.S. has been slower.
Much slower on full decrim.
Oh, yeah.
But ESPLR notes there is movement. Bills being proposed in states like New Hampshire, D.C., Vermont, New York, Louisiana, Oregon, Rhode Island, Illinois, suggests the idea is gaining traction politically.
And in the meantime, harm reduction efforts are happening.
Yes, lots of focus there. Things like laws giving sex workers immunity from prostitution charges if they report a serious crime, like assault or robbery.
So they can report violence without fearing arrest themselves. Makes sense.
Also, repealing those old loitering for prostitution laws, which were often used discriminatorily. New York and California did that. And major efforts to decriminalize HIV status.
Right, getting rid of laws that criminalize exposure or non-disclosure, which just adds stigma and hurts public health.
Exactly. Plus, banning police from having sexual contact with people during investigations, and new laws protecting dancers' rights, like in Washington state.
That Washington Strippers Bill of Rights sounds significant. Panic buttons, reporting procedures.
Yeah, rules about fees, anti-discrimination, concrete steps to improve conditions in that specific sector. So even without full decrim, these measures reduce harm.
Though they do mention some setbacks, like failed ballot initiatives in Berkeley and San Francisco years ago, so it's not an easy road.
Definitely not. Public opinion and political will are still major hurdles. Which brings us to their own legal battles, like ESPRE v. Gascon.
Right, the California lawsuit. What was the core argument there?
They tried to use the Lawrence v. Texas precedent, the Supreme Court case protecting private, consensual sexual conduct, and argue it should extend to commercial consensual sex between adults. Basically, a right to sexual privacy includes the right to engage in sex work.
And they got support from groups like the ACLU, Lambda Legal. That George Carlin quote they used was memorable.
Yeah. Selling is legal. Effing is legal. Why isn't selling effing legal? Really cut through the noise.
But ultimately, the lawsuit didn't succeed in court.
No, it was dismissed by the district court. The Ninth Circuit upheld the dismissal in 2018. And given the way the Supreme Court was looking, they decided not to appeal further.
But ECLER argues the case still had value.
Absolutely. It generated a lot of media attention, much of it positive or at least thoughtful. It gave their plaintiffs a platform, helped shift the public conversation, put decriminalization more squarely on the map.
So even a legal loss contributed to the broader movement.
Precisely. It built momentum for their policy agenda, which leads us to their concrete recommendations for 2025. The 15 key steps.
Okay, let's run through some highlights. Number one is obvious. Decriminalize sex work. Fully.
And retroactively, they stress prosecutors should just decline charges immediately, and they want reparations programs for the harms caused by criminalization over the years.
That's a big step beyond just changing the law acknowledging past harms. They also want to repeal those anti-trafficking laws like FOSTA and TVPA.
Yeah, arguing they've done more harm than good to the people they were supposedly meant to protect, at least concerning consensual sex workers.
And immunity. We touched on that, protecting workers who report crimes from being charged with prostitution themselves.
Crucial for safety. Plus, Broad non-discrimination protections against bias in housing, jobs, financial services, even in court for providers, clients, support staff.
And specifically prohibiting profiling based on gender identity, sexual orientation, race.
Definitely. And decriminalizing HIV status completely. They also want more oversight of anti-trafficking groups that get public money.
Monitoring them, having a grievance process.
Yeah, accountability. Same for law enforcement, more transparency around prostitution and trafficking arrests, public reporting, data collection.
Privacy is a big theme, too. Protecting against data scraping, surveillance, publicizing arrests.
Right. They call for stronger privacy laws like ADPPA or GDPR models applied here. Address social media deplatforming, scrutinize registration requirements if legalization is considered, ban media filming during arrests. They even did a whole report in 2023 on tech-based privacy violations.
Wow, things like stingrays, facial recognition.
All of it. Phone ripping, license plate readers, and expanding protections for dancers, using Washington state as a model.
Panic buttons, violence reporting, fee regulation.
Yep. Also, rules against prosecutorial misconduct in these cases, and a clear ban with real penalties on cops having sexual contact during investigations, prosecuted as assault.
And finally, automatic vacatur expunging past records.
Absolutely critical. Making sure past convictions related to decriminalized offenses are automatically wiped clean. It's a really comprehensive package.
Looking at all 15 points, it's clear they've thought through not just the main goal, decrim, but all the surrounding issues, past harms, discrimination, privacy, accountability.
It really is a cohesive vision, moving away from criminal punishment towards a framework based on rights, safety, and health for everyone involved in erotic services.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, the core message from ESPLER's agenda is pretty stark. Criminalizing consensual sex work causes immense harm and discrimination.
And they argue that a rights-based approach, specifically full decriminalization, isn't just about freedom, it's actually essential for public safety and effective policy.
It's definitely been fascinating to unpack their arguments, the evidence they use from other countries, the legal reasoning, the focus on lived experience.
Yeah, it really highlights why understanding these debates is important for anyone interested in human rights, public health, how laws actually impact people.
So a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Considering everything we've discussed from the ESPLR agenda, what strikes you as the strongest argument for or against full decriminalization? And what kind of societal changes, good or bad, could you imagine happening if these policies became widespread?
Definitely something to think about. And if you're interested, exploring Issa Seller's own website and reports would be a good next step. There's a lot more detail there.
Indeed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.